Hi everyone, it's Katie, and today I wanted to do another Therapeutic Tarot episode, or video, whatever you want to call it. In these videos I just share with you some of the tools and techniques that I use involving tarot in one way or another, or oracle, that I do to kind of help with my mental well-being and my mental wellness, maintaining that, supporting that, whatever that looks like for me at any given time. I would ask, however, before we get into it, that if you haven't watched my introductory video to this series, to please do so. I will leave a link to it below and also in the cards, wherever they are. I do think it's really important that you watch that first, just because that kind of will let you know where I'm coming from with all of this stuff, just my perspective and what I'm trying to achieve with these videos. So please watch that before you watch this if you haven't already. So this is a really simple technique. Basically it stems from my work in DBT. DBT is broken down into 4 different sections, one of which is distress tolerance. And this is really important stuff for people who are especially unwell at the moment. But I think it's really helpful for anyone. I found it especially helpful for anxiety, but I think it can be helpful for any distressing emotions. Basically, the whole idea of distress tolerance is being able to tolerate distress and building your confidence that, knowing that these emotions, they're not going to kill you, you're going to be okay, that they don't really have, or they don't really have to have power over you. So one of the first things we did in distress tolerance, the first was self-soothing and mindfulness, but then that was kind of more preparing you for actual distress tolerance work. The first step of distress tolerance was to sit with an uncomfortable emotion, a distressing emotion. And to sit with it, allow ourselves to sit with it for 30 seconds, a minute, whatever felt challenging but achievable. And obviously not to start with something, hugely traumatic or something that is literally, will set off a panic attack. You want to kind of start something that is challenging, but not overwhelming, because the whole point of any kind of tolerance, you need to build it up, right? So that's what this work was about. It was about just sitting with an uncomfortable feeling. Because what that does is, if you give yourself a timer of 30 seconds or a minute, that's a kind of good starting. But if you struggle with that, start with 10 seconds. The whole point is, once you kind of get to a certain time and you've sat with that and then you self-soothe and do whatever you need to do, it builds confidence over time that you can support yourself and you can survive these really troubling, difficult emotions. Because what I found with my mental illness and recovery, I thought that being well meant that I wouldn't have anxiety anymore. I wouldn't have suicidal, paranoid, depressive thoughts and feelings anymore. And certainly as I've gotten more well, I have them to a lesser extent. They're less severe, but I still have them. It's just that I'm better able to deal with them. I think that is the biggest thing with recovery and maintenance. It's getting better at coping with, supporting yourself through challenging emotions. And this stuff, distress tolerance stuff, is the absolute basis, foundation, that is essential, especially for people who are really struggling with this stuff. It's building up that tolerance so that you have a little bit of confidence that this thought, this emotion that you're experiencing, you can get yourself through it. So before going into this, it is important that you have an awareness of what your self-care, self-soothing tools are. So whatever that might be, it might be going for a walk, doing a bit of exercise, playing with a dog, reading, having a cookie or a cup of tea, whatever it is, something that soothes you. Be 100% aware of 3 or 5 things that you can do that will soothe you before going into this. And so of course, when we were practicing this in DBT, I had to bring tarot into the equation, didn't I? And so there was one exercise that was literally us sitting in a room together, and we were asked to think about something that we found upsetting. And I would often struggle to do this because especially when I was unwell, I was just like, well, everything, it's just everything. And that's not really helpful when we're trying to focus, really kind of sit with one emotion. So of course I brought tarot in. And then I found this really helpful, kind of experiencing different emotions. It's pretty obvious, it's pretty simple, but basically I would just go through the cards face up. I mean, you can do this any way you want, but this is what I was doing, and pick out a card that just made me feel uncomfortable. I would, probably not pull out the Tower, especially if I was just starting, because for me, this card actually does scare me. It brings up emotions that I find really quite triggering sometimes if I'm not in a great place. So maybe I would pick something like the Seven of Cups. I actually do find this card, and I mean, you can go from the meaning or you can go from the imagery, and for me, I was more going from the imagery at this point. And for me, this card feels quite overwhelming, of being unsure and uncertain. Like, there's so many options and I don't know what to do. And that can bring up quite a bit of anxiety for me. Although before you do this, as I said, check in and make sure that's not too big. Check in and make sure that that's something that's going to challenge you, but also something that, isn't your worst nightmare. So I would pick a card and I'd be like, okay, this one, that's bringing up some emotions for me that are uncomfortable. And then I would pick a time. For me, when I was starting, it was 15 seconds. You might be fairly well at the moment, so you might pick a minute or 2 minutes, whatever it is. Pick a fairly short amount of time, put a timer on your phone if you want to, and just sit with the emotions that this card brings up for you. Just don't question them, don't challenge them, just allow them to be in your body. If you feel like crying a little bit, that's okay. Just allow. That's what this is about, just allowing. Not struggling against them, not trying to fight them, not trying to convince yourself that they're not real or not important, just allowing. And so once you're done, once your timer rings off, that's when you start all that self-soothing stuff that we talked about before. Depending on how well you are, or depending how tolerant you are of your distressing emotions, you might just get up and go for a little walk and be fine. You might have to sit and kind of maybe talk to a friend. Whatever it is, do what you need to do to get out of those emotions, because now that you've experienced them, it's time to move on. If at any point during the 2 minutes, whatever you've picked, your emotions get too strong, you got to find that line between challenging yourself and, kind of, okay, this is building tolerance and I'm okay, I'm still okay, and I'm about to have a panic attack. If you're literally at that point, then stop and self-soothe, and come back and try and do this in a few days, a few weeks, and start with something smaller. It's really important that we start small and then build up, rather than start too big, because then this activity itself becomes distressing, and that's not what we want. So what I like about using cards for this, I know it's super simple, but the fact that I don't have to overthink what I'm trying to experience, it's just kind of like, oh, this card brings up a few feelings for me, maybe I should sit with those. And then, if I want to try it again in a few days, I can pick a different card. Maybe it's, I don't know, the Seven of Swords. Maybe this brings up some emotions for me. Maybe a little bit of betrayal that I haven't quite healed from, or whatever. Again, don't want to start too big, but as you move through, you might start wanting to, if you get through a minute and, you feel something, but you're fine, then maybe you want to start looking at some things that trigger you a little bit more and going for a little bit longer time. That's what this is all about. It's about building tolerance. And I found tarot and working through some of these harder cards, or the cards that I personally found hard, when I kind of stepped into the emotion they brought up in me, I found that really helpful. It kind of helped me walk through and experience a whole bunch of different emotions that maybe I wouldn't have organically thought of to experience. I probably would have just kept going to anxiety or those suicidal thoughts. I wouldn't have really kind of considered sitting with, for example, the Seven of Swords. Maybe I felt a little bit betrayed by somebody, or just that feeling of betrayal or hurt. Kind of being able to sit with these different experiences, these emotional experiences, because our emotional experience is so broad. We have this massive spectrum, and I think we don't always, really sit with the variety of emotions that we can experience. And I think this is especially helpful because the more different types of emotions we're really familiar with, because we've sat with them, the less scary they feel when they pop up. If we're familiar with them, if we can name them, if we can say, hey, I've felt this before and I got through 2 minutes of sitting with it, this is going to be okay. the more we can do that, the less, you know, the outside world can really trigger us. Because I think a lot of the time, either it's emotions that we have so often that we feel overwhelmed by the potential of how bad they can get, or it's emotions that we don't really recognize, that we feel are like, oh, what's going on? I don't understand this emotion. So we make up stuff in our head to try and explain it, and often that stuff in our head is worse than the reality. So for me, I found this distress tolerance absolutely essential, and I found tarot a really simple, helpful way of dropping into certain emotions that weren't too big, and dropping into different types of emotions over time. Also, the really cool benefit of this is that you really get to know emotionally. You get to develop an emotional connection and appreciation and understanding of these cards and the lessons that they provide us. So, I mean, it's a wonderful way to learn about your tarot deck as well. I'm using the example of my Rider-Waite-Smith Centennial Edition just because that's what I have out. But, I mean, any deck works for this, because what you're going from is just the emotional response you have to certain cards. I feel like I say this for almost every Therapeutic tarot series, but the Anna Kay is a great one for this because of its storybook quality. Another deck that I've found really great is the Spiral Tarot, just because for me it's very evocative. There's a lot of color and movement, a lot of emotion in this deck. Another one that kind of really I think works well for me is a deck like the World Spirit Tarot. I think because it's so grounded in you know, the physical, the mundane, the images are relatively relatable. So that's another good one, I think. I've also found the Osho Zen quite good for this stuff. Again, I think because it's a very psychological, spiritual too, but it feels very rooted in emotions. It's quite flowy. These are just some ideas. Of course, whatever deck works for you, whatever deck you have on hand is perfect. Just make sure to take care of yourself doing this. Like, I mean, obviously this is a little bit challenging. Depending on how well you are, you may find this quite challenging. Obviously the idea is to keep it small and approachable, achievable, and to make sure you have those self-care, self-soothe tools at the ready. Maybe write them down before you even start doing this, so that, you know, for some people when their anxiety gets going, it's hard to think of what soothes you. So maybe write them down and have them next to you. Whatever you need to do to keep yourself safe. The whole idea of this is that it's achievable, but that it pushes you. If you're pushing yourself too far, then, you know, you're not getting the point of the exercise. You're not achieving anything. You're not helping yourself. So this is probably the most challenging of the examples that I've provided in my Therapeutic Tarot series, because it is directly dealing with hard emotions. And sitting with them can be really challenging. So simple, super simple exercise, but I hope you have gotten something from this. I hope it gives you some ideas about the different ways you can use your cards to hopefully, if you're not doing so well now, hopefully recovering a little bit, or, you know, just kind of maintaining that level of distress tolerance, so that, you know, it's kind of like strengthening a muscle, and you, even if you are well, you need to maintain that tolerance. I think that's important. So even though I don't do this stuff as often as I used to, I do it for longer in one sitting, and I think it helps. I think it's really beneficial for checking in for what's triggering me, how much, and just kind of reminding myself that I'm able to get myself through this stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Any comments or questions, as always, leave those below. I'll do my best to get back to you. And until next time, guys, so much love. Bye.